All right, we want to start off in dealing with the whole issue of insomnia. And then later on, the second hour, we're going to be dealing with the issue of chronic fatigue. What is this issue of insomnia? 1/3 of our lives on an average is spent sleeping. That's a significant piece of data. So much of your life is spent sleeping. That's encouraging. You realize that a lot of time goes by and you are sound asleep when it does. Quality of sleep is a critical issue for many people. It's not just how much time is spent in bed, but whether or not you are experiencing high quality sleep. Now, sleep is just as important as balanced nutrition and exercise in maintaining good health as well. In fact, when a person doesn't get enough sleep, it has an hallucinogenic effect upon their life. Back just a few years ago, there was a guy who tried to set the Guinness Book of World Records by going, he was a radio disc jockey, and he was going to do 2 or 3 days of continuous broadcasting without getting any sleep. With all that energy that's expounded in terms of broadcasting and not getting any sleep, by the 3rd or 4th day, he was climbing the walls and he was seeing things that weren't there. There is a sense in which lack of sleep produces, this is the way God has created us, in us certain, causes a certain mechanism where now reality is completely distorted. Chemicals are released in the brain that are not normal when we've had the proper kind of sleep. Or there's a deficit of certain chemicals in the brain as well. And we begin to imagine things that aren't there. We begin to see things that aren't there. And this particular disc jockey saw large bugs crawling up the wall. And so as a result of it, they had to go in and drag him out of the control room, the broadcast control room, having gone completely nuts. And that was all as a result of sleep. Sleep has this hallucinogenic effect upon people, just the way hallucinogenic drugs do, or lack of sleep has that effect. So if you're not getting good sleep, it will have an effect upon your health and ability to think and your ability to concentrate as well. Your capacity to be able to stay focused on a particular task or a particular problem will be greatly affected if you're not getting the proper kind of sleep that you need to get. It's interesting what has happened, what has been attributed to a lack of proper sleep. These disasters occurred in the wee hours of the night. Some of you probably remember the meltdown at 3 Mile Island in New York State. That happened in the wee hours of the night, in the morning. And there are some who attribute it to the fact that there was sleep cause effect in many of the workers that were supposed to oversee the site at that time. Some of you don't realize, but the Exxon Valdez oil spill on Bly Reef in Alaska occurred in the wee hours of the night. And there are so many who believe that that's attributed to the fact that the people on duty, whether it was the captain or whoever was that was on duty of the ship, had actually were so sleep deprived that they made terrible judgments. Or Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant in Russia. It was during the wee hours of the night that that disaster occurred as well. So, or at least the beginning of what occurred, what eventually became a disaster. So all of that was a result of sleep. Now, those are kind of macro effects of lack of sleep. You can only imagine what's going to happen on the micro effects of individual people in their lives when they don't have enough sleep. How it affects, you as a student, your studies, your ability to concentrate, your ability to read, your ability to write when you haven't had the proper kind of sleep. Most adults need about 8 hours per night of sleep on an average. Now, that doesn't fit everybody perfectly, but if we were taking a look at most studies on this, seem to confirm that about, less than probably 1% to 2% of adults only need 3 hours of sleep a night. And those are the type of people that are usually real extreme geniuses. Einstein only needed a couple hours of sleep every night. That's all he needed. Extreme geniuses tend to be the type of people that only need that amount of sleep at night. Some people need 4 hours of sleep, which would be probably about 2 or 3% of the population. There are others who need about 4 or 5 hours of sleep. That would be about 4% of the population. 6 hours of sleep then suddenly jumps up to 10% of the population. 7 hours of sleep jumps way up to 30% of the population. 8 hours of sleep, 45% of the population. 8 hours of sleep. Yes?
How do they measure this? I mean, is they taking a survey, or do they?
Yeah, obviously they have a representative group, probably about 1,000. That's kind of a standard norm group. And they survey, they keep strict standards on when they go to bed, when they fall asleep, how long they're asleep. They have to record all this. And
Functioning properly and stuff like that.
yeah, exactly. How they're reacting to life. 9 hours of sleep a night, about 6% of the population. And 10 hours of sleep a night, again, probably about 2 or 3% of the population. So it gives you a little bit of an idea on who needs what. But your average person, average normally functioning person, between 7 and 8 hours of sleep a night is the vast majority of people, by far. And if you're not getting that, somehow you're probably depriving yourself of some kind of sleep. So that's critical. So let's talk about the issue of insomnia in relationship to sleep. Insomnia, not being able to sleep. I want to make some observation. Insomnia is a subjective experience because it describes a variety of different experiences that people have in relationship to their sleep and their patterns. So somewhat, it's kind of hard to define insomnia. It can involve difficulty falling to sleep or staying asleep or enjoying a restful night's sleep. It can involve that. It's usually considered a symptom that may be caused by many factors. Like, for instance, where you live in the world. If you live in Alaska, where the sun shines 6 months of the year, most of the day, and then it's dark 6 months of the year, most of the day, then during the times of light, you're probably awake an awful lot, and it's hard to go to sleep. During the times of darkness, you tend to sleep a lot longer and a lot more if you're way up north. So it could be factors like that. Sleep deprivation is associated with bizarre behavior. As I said, a lack of sleep can have an hallucinogenic effect upon people. After 3 to 5 days of sleep deprivation, chemicals similar to LSD start to appear in the blood. And so that's the kind of thing that produces those hallucinogenic effects. They begin to see things that aren't there, or imagine or hear things that aren't there. And they begin to think that they're schizophrenic. It causes memory failure and impairs normal mental acuity. It limits attention span. Hallucinations are common, perhaps brought on by the LSD-like substances. After sleep deprivation, 10 days may be required for all body functions to return to normal. Once you've deprived yourself for a long period of time, it would take about 10 days of very faithful 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night in order to return to a normal functioning lifestyle again. There's a link between sleep and maintenance of the immune system. We know that for sure. The immune system, when you're not getting the proper kind of sleep or enough sleep, tends to be compromised, and you tend to be more susceptible to physical problems, viruses, bacteria, general diseases that come along because your immune system is so depressed. Sleep changes over a person's lifetime. Usually, when a person is younger, they tend to need more sleep and require more sleep. As they tend to get older, they require less and less sleep. When you get to be retirement age, you don't sleep as long or as well. You tend to get tired earlier in the evening, but then you wake up several times in the middle of the night as you get older. Boy, that's come to me because this past week I found out I'm going to be a grandfather. Now, I know that most of you thought I was around 25 years of age, but now I'm going to be a grandfather, so I'm getting older. All right? And I realize that I'm getting older. So you don't sleep as well as you did when you were young. I can remember when I was in college, I could sleep through, you could have World War III going on in the room. They could be playing music, have lights on, sleep right through it. Now, just like Ecclesiastes 12 talks about, I awake at the least little sound. Whoop, I'm wide awake, right? Which tells me that I'm not really sleeping really, really deep. There are several true organic problems may contribute to insomnia as well. Sometimes certain kinds of diseases do have an effect upon a person's capacity to be able to sleep. Insomnia is influenced by age and gender. In 1995, 49% of adults questioned had difficulty sleeping, an average of at least 5 nights per month. This equates to 87 million people with problems sleeping. Stress and worry are some of the greatest reasons that are given. 31% admitted to dozing off while driving a vehicle. 12% of those who did were involved in an accident. 37%. Wow. That almost is scary driving the LA freeways. You think of 37% or 31% of all those out there have the potential to fall asleep. No wonder there are accidents the way we have them. Well, what are some of the costs that are related to insomnia? Well, in 1990, direct costs of medical care or self-treatment includes costs borne by parents, organized healthcare providers, insurance companies, or the government, were estimated at $10.9 billion. By 1993, costs had risen to $15.4 billion. 1994, the indirect costs, such as decreased productivity at work, healthcare needs, property costs related to accidents, and medical costs associated with the comorbid conditions were estimated to be between $70 billion and $92 billion annually. Wow, that's pretty serious cost. Now, it could be questioned how those numbers were really arrived at, but I would imagine that everybody putting those numbers together would say that these are estimates. But it does take a toll financially. So let's define, what are we talking about as best as we can? Well, a precise definition is difficult because the amount of sleep needed by each individual to function at peak performance varies. Some studies suggest newborns require 16 to 18 hours. Children to the age of 10, 9 to 10 hours. Age 10 to adult, 7.5 to 8 hours. Elderly, 6.5 hours. But too many make exceptions to these hard and fast rules. There are many who do make a lot of exceptions. What are solutions for insomnia? Well, many people obviously turn to medications, sleeping pills, whether they're over-the-counter sleeping pills or prescription type of sleeping pills. There are many who do that. Some turn to sleep hygiene, where you set a regular time to go to bed and wake up. You try to normalize your routine as much as possible. Even if you're staying in an unfamiliar place, you try to eat dinner at the same time you normally would. You don't go to bed early. You get up and out of bed at a regular time, even if sleep was very poor. So you make certain that the sleeping room is quiet, darkened, and cool. And then a person tends to do better in terms of their sleep. All of that is just what is commonly referred to as common sense or hygiene. But it's amazing how many people don't practice good wisdom or hygiene when it comes to these kind of issues and in terms of sleep. Exercise regularly, early in the day, or preferably in the late afternoon, but not in the evening. Avoid within 3 hours of bedtime, because that produces certain chemicals in your body when you exercise, and if you're doing it 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed, those chemicals will still be working on your body. So at least exercise 3 hours before you plan on going to bed and going to sleep. Has a tendency for those chemicals to dissipate in your body, and then your muscles are much more ready to relax. You're too tensed up. Avoid afternoon or evening napping. When you're having difficulty sleeping at night, you need to consolidate your sleep time. Avoid confrontations with others just before bedtime. Avoid frustrating activities such as balancing the checkbook just before you go to bed. That's a very frustrating responsibility, especially in seminary. All right. Avoid spicy or heavy foods during the evening as well. And of course, do not eat meals, small snacks to alleviate hunger is okay, or drink large quantities of liquids late at night, especially caffeine-related liquids. Coffee, sodas with caffeine in them. Well, that'll have a tendency to work on your system, and you won't sleep as well at night either. Don't read, work, eat, or watch TV in bed. The bed should only be for sleep-related purposes. Don't do that. All right? Don't read, work, because you have a tendency, then your body tends to equate that with some kind of stimulation. So when you lay down, it's not equated with this is a time to go to sleep. We are creatures of habit. That's the way God created us. And sometimes when we get ourselves into bad habits and our body is used to a certain bad practice, then it's very, very difficult to get out of that bad practice. All right. If sleep doesn't begin within a short time, that is 20 to 30 minutes, leave the bed and don't return until sleepy. Some say the opposite. Continue to lie in bed with your eyes closed. But the general rule of thumb is get up, get out of bed, you're not sleepy enough, and then get sleepy. Maybe go do something, read, whatever it is that's going to help you to be sleepy, and then go back to bed, and you'll be ready to fall asleep hopefully within 20 or 30 minutes of laying down. Sleep only as much as needed to feel refreshed and alert upon arising. Avoid oversleeping. Avoid or minimize caffeine, as we talked about before. Coffee, tea, soft drinks, alcohol and tobacco, especially near bedtime. More specifically, avoid caffeine for at least 6 hours before bedtime. Also, some medications like Sudafed, which have the same kind of effect or caffeine effect as some of those sodas. So when you feel fatigued early in the morning or in the afternoon, take a brisk walk outdoors. This will help you readjust your body clock so that circadian patterns in terms of being awake and asleep, and in relationship also as well to the temperature of your body, which goes down during the peak times of the night. You want to make sure those patterns are into a routine. All right, if we were taking a look at the stages of sleep, they would look like this. Some studies, this is an electroencephalograph, or EEG, which uses electrodes placed there on the scalp to record and amplify electrical activity in the brain. When a person is awake, you can see the EEG pattern here. It looks something like this. This is kind of consciousness. And this is what's happening, at least what the EEG is able to record in terms of brain activity. So we are able to identify certain stages of sleep based upon those EEG patterns. There's pre-sleep, and then there's hypnagogic state, which is about 10 to 15 minutes. Then there's the state that occurs as a person is just falling to sleep. And then it's at that particular time, that's a time, for some reason, for immense mental creativity. Just as you're falling asleep. Maybe you've had that where you've been writing a paper or you've been trying to solve a problem during the day, and just as you were falling asleep, you thought of the answer to it. I know what it is. I know what I need to do. And you have to get yourself out of bed and you have to write it down in order to get that thing done. Well, that's very common among a lot of people, that just before you fall asleep, for some reason your brain is immensely creative. A person puts pieces together which one may not otherwise have constructed during this particular time. And so you're putting relationships together that you didn't do before in your normal conscious waking time. So in identifying some of these stages, stage 1 would be something like this. The alpha waves are very, very prominent in stage 1 of sleep. And you can see this. This is quite a bit different than what we saw in terms of the consciousness and being awake. The alpha waves are very, very prominent. A person is easily awakened during this first stage of sleep. Very easy to do that. Stage 2, then there are irregular, larger wave patterns which are much more prominent. In fact, you can see this. The EEG shows them up. And in fact, there's a sporadic boost in these wave patterns. And these are what we call sleep spindles. All right? This is stage 2 where you're falling asleep. And this person is much harder to awaken. At stage 2, you try to wake this person and they do not want to wake up. All right? This is usually the stage that's going on at that time. Sleep spindles may occur, and sudden muscle contractions. Some of you probably remember that. As you're falling asleep, all of a sudden you'll jerk. Or you've seen somebody do that. And they think that there is a relationship between these spiked energy things that are going on in the brain and these sleep spindles and your muscle movements. All right? So there's sudden jerking that occurs that is involuntary. Yes?
What about the ones like you see somebody sleeping on a desk, and then they...
Yeah.
Is that the same thing?
Yeah, probably so. You've seen somebody that's laying down or laying on a desk like that, and you see them jerk, then they're falling into stage 2 of sleep. So that happens during that particular stage. Well, then stage 3 is where the delta waves become prominent. Large, slow, 1/5, 2/5 cycles per minute. Now, this is a radically different, changed looking EEG. And you can see these delta waves. These are just dipping way low in terms of stage 3 of sleep. Deep sleep occurs at this particular stage. Once you reached stage 3, it's as if your brain is relaxed and you start to really sleep. Stage 4, then, very, very large delta waves. You can see them now, they're extended, and this is very deep sleep is experienced. Sleepwalking and talking can occur, and the person won't remember it the next day. All right? They'll get up. I don't know, do we have any sleepwalkers that's willing to admit it in here, in our class? Nobody's willing to admit it, okay. That's okay, you don't have to. It doesn't have to be confession time here. But we had a gal in our congregation where she had a terrible problem with sleepwalking. And in fact, her parents had to put little bells and stuff on her door, which would wake them up in the middle of the night when she'd open her door and leave, or bells on her window because she'd crawl out her window. One day they found her. She was in her pajamas. She had walked all the way down the street and was sitting at a public park bench in the middle of the night. And Mom and Dad was sound asleep when it happened. And the next day the girl had no recollection of what had happened. Even though she was able to kind of, in a groggy fashion, interact with her mom and dad, they basically took her back home, put her to sleep, and bolted the door so that she couldn't get out the door in the middle of the night. So it's this stage 4 of sleep that occurs. And this is also the stage where nightmares and terrors may occur. Now, what's happening when when the brain goes through all this, well, God has designed us in such a way that when the brain goes through all that activity, it's as if your brain is purging a lot of the sensory data it has taken in all day. You have a lot of data coming in that is, in a sense, meaningless data to you. Temperature is data coming to your brain. Smells are data coming to your brain. Eyesight, you notice things even though you don't concentrate. You don't notice an awful lot of things. Daylight activities, things, people going by, stuff like this, is data going in, data going in. Things you hear. If you listen very carefully, you can hear something running in the background. Or you can hear our data projector and a little fan running there. Well, your brain's registering all that data, even though you choose not to focus on it. And it's at sleep at night that it's almost as if God has designed it in such a way that all that's purged. So the next day, you'll feel refreshed. There's a significant change that occurs. So those are the 4 stages of sleep. Now, it's interesting. It's during rapid eye movement sleep, or what they call REM sleep, that sawtooth-looking EEG patterns begin to emerge. A person's eyelids begin to flutter. You ever watch somebody sleep? Their eyelids begin to flutter. And this is where they're in rapid eye movement sleep. REM normally follows a 90-minute pattern. 5 dream periods occur during a typical 8-hour night. So stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's this pattern of 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, then 40 minutes. REM, REM, REM at the end of each one of those, or until wakened. Now, if a person, studies have been done on this, if a person is awakened just before these 5-minute, 10-minute, 20-minute, 30-minute patterns, then they will mentally go crazy if they're not allowed to have REM. There are chemical processes that occur in the brain that causes a person to lose track of reality, just like the hallucinogenic effects, the LSD type chemicals that are released in the brain. But here you are sleeping, you're going through the other stages, but you're not getting REM sleep. So that shows you just how important that REM sleep is overall. And if you were to look at a typical night of sleep, you can see this here. A person is awake and they fall to stage 1 sleep, stage 2 sleep, stage 3, stage 4, and then within the first hour and a half, they start coming out of it real quickly, and they come clear back up to REM, and they experience 5 minutes of REM. Then they go right back into stage, from stage 1 to stage 2, 3, 4, a little bit, about the same amount of time, an hour to an hour and a half. Then they start coming out of it, and now they got 10 minutes REM. 10 minutes. Then back down, stage 2, and stage 3. They don't go clear down now, and they come back out of it, and now they got 20 minutes REM that occurs. Then down to stage 1. Then they have 30 minutes REM. Back stage 1 or until wakened, hence the 30 minutes. So in an average 8-hour evening of sleep, you experience stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and then REM for 5 minutes. Stage 1, 2, 3, 4 again, REM for 10 minutes. Stage 1, 2, and 3, REM for 20 minutes. Stage 1 and 2, REM for 30 minutes. Stage 1 and 2 again, REM for 40 minutes. And that seems to be the pattern that goes all the way through a normal, we're talking about a normal 8-hour pattern of sleep. If we're to understand the process of what goes on. Aaron?
So someone that only needs 6 hours of sleep, then do they compact this, or do they just not get as many REM cycles?
They don't get as many REM cycles usually. No, it usually stays at a pretty consistent pattern with people. So, which are really critical. Now you can see, if we were to lay these EEG patterns side by side down the left-hand side of this chart, this is awake, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and REM sleep. You can see the contrast here. This is awake, and 1, and 2, And you can see these sleep spindles here that occur at 2. Stage 3, then the delta patterns, 3 and 4, the delta patterns are really big. Big delta patterns. Then REM for 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes, then 30, and then 40. It looks like this. It gives you a pretty good idea of how this works. If we were to take a look at this, a chart kind of more spread out, down here across the bottom, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour, 5, all the way out to 8 hours of sleep, there seems to be the pattern. This is a person that's awake, and then they go through all 4 stages. They're up to 5 minutes REM, down 3 or all 4 stages, back up to 10 minutes REM, down 2 stages, then up to REM up to 1, and then or stage 2, and then REM for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then 40 minutes, all the way out. That gives you a little bit of an idea of how those sleep disorders, how a normal night's sleep, I should say, should go. So what are we talking about? If we were to take a look at this from a biblical perspective, God has given us, in our day and age today, a wonderful capacity with the technology that we have to understand some of the physiology of sleep. But the key thing for us is going to be looking at this from a biblical perspective. Now, there are illustrations of insomnia. For example, if you take your Bible, let's go back to Esther. Esther chapter 6 and verse 1. During that night, the king could not sleep, so that he gave order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So here, the king is unable to sleep. He was experiencing insomnia. If we go to Daniel chapter 2, we can see the same thing true here in the book of Daniel. In chapter 2 and verse 1. Now in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, verse 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Here's another example of insomnia, an illustration of insomnia. Now what then are ingredients for a restful night's sleep? By the way, in both of those cases, both in Esther and Daniel, one of the things that contributed to their sleeplessness was the king's own sins in relationship to making major decisions about what God wanted him to do or didn't want him to do, which contributed to his restlessness. Well, one of the first things, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 through 26, deals with the whole concept of wisdom. And verse 13 says, how blessed is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding, for its profit is better than the profit of silver, and its gain than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all of her paths are peace. She is like a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold fast to her. By the Lord, by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens, by his knowledge the deeps were broken up, and the skies dripped with dew. My son, let them not depart from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so that they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. They will walk in your way securely. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. So you get this idea. A person who pays attention to wisdom, who acts wisely in life, then their sleep is sweet. That's a good way to look at sleep. Who is wise in the general affairs of life, who uses biblical wisdom, who's committed to biblical morality, then their sleep is sweet. They're not plagued by guilt. They're not plagued by irresponsibility. They're not plagued by laziness or being a sluggard. And hence, they have to worry about poverty coming on them. They're not plagued by any of that. They have sweet sleep. So seeing all of life from God's point of view is what a truly wise person is. Thinking God's thoughts after him. Verse 24 says we don't have to have fear at night. Verse 26 says our confidence is in God. So a change in thinking affects every area of our life. Philippians 4:8, we have to saturate our mind with Scripture. The things that are true, honest, just, worthy, excellent, praiseworthy. We're supposed to dwell and set our mind down on those things. A truly wise person does that. So that's part of the ingredients of a sweet sleep. Fear of God, Proverbs 19:23. Here, in the sense, a God consciousness. Verse 23 says, the fear of the Lord leads to life so that one may sleep satisfied, untouched by evil. So acknowledging his perfect sovereignty and his perfect goodness, and awe and a respect for him that produces the attitude of worship as a habit of life. You're at peace with God, as Proverbs 3 has already talked about. You're at peace because you're following his wisdom. This includes trusting God. When you truly understand who he is and are thus provoked to worship him as a lifestyle, you grow in your trust of him. Then there is obedience and holiness. Back in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 20 through 23. Verse 20 says, my son, observe the commandments of your father. Do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually on your heart. Tie them around your neck. When you walk about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light, and reproof for disciplines are the way of life. That has to do with holiness. So, when you don't do that, when you disobey, when you're unholy, then there's a corresponding guilt that you carry, and that guilt will plague your sleep. Contentment is another issue. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 12. Ecclesiastes, here Solomon is dealing in this autobiographical polemic. In verse 12, he says, the sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. In other words, you work hard, you do all the duties you're supposed to do that day, then you'll sleep better at night. The person who doesn't get, who concentrates only on satisfying their own appetite, then doesn't end up sleeping very well. That's a very self-centered part of life. A good illustration of that, as you can see with the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 and following, where Paul talks about his own life being at peace. But he says, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am in. I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So, there's a good illustration of that. He understood the concept of contentment, and Paul slept well at night. Or we go back to Psalm chapter 4 and verse 8, and here David deals with the whole issue of his own contentment with God, which set his mind at rest. In peace, he says, I will both lie down and sleep, for thou alone, O Lord, dost make me to dwell in safety. Which, by the way, is a wonderful verse to get someone who's struggling with insomnia to memorize. Psalm 4:8. It's a great one. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep, for thou alone, O Lord, dost make me to dwell in safety. But what do you do if I just can't get to sleep, or if I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep? Well, I've got to see the inability to sleep in light of the sovereignty of God. That's vitally important. Believe that these times represents opportunities from God. There's an opportunity for examination. Is it because of guilt? Is it because of sin in my life? Maybe it's a lack of trust in God or a lack of a biblical mindset that's really oriented towards wisdom. Is that the reason? Or, as the psalmist says in Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24. Let's go over there real quickly and take a look at that. Verses 23 and 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. So the psalmist here, David says, search me. I want you to know me. Sleeplessness, his anxiousness was an occasion for him to have God do some evaluations of his life. Is he doing the right thing? It's an opportunity for meditation as well. As Psalm 119, verse 148 talks about. My eyes anticipate the night watches, that I may meditate on thy word. Or Psalm chapter 16 and verse 7. Psalm 16 and verse 7 has to do with meditation as well. I will bless the Lord who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night. So he meditates on the things of the Lord in the night. And then there's Psalm 77 and verse 6. Psalm 77 and verse 6. Where this is a psalm of Asaph. Verse 6, I will remember my song in the night. I will meditate with my heart, and my spirit ponders. Or there's Psalm 77, verses 11 and 12. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate on all thy work, and muse on thy deeds. Or, going back to Psalm 4:4, where the psalmist here says, tremble and do not sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still, Selah. So it's an opportunity for meditation. It's also an opportunity for communication. Psalm 4:1, it's an opportunity ultimately to pray to God. When we're experiencing sleeplessness in the middle of the night, this is a great opportunity to use the time wisely. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast relieved me in my distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Or Psalm 77 again, back to what Asaph has to say. Verses 1 and 2. He says, my voice rises to God, and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God, and he will hear me. In the day of trouble I sought the Lord. In the night my hand was stretched out without weariness. Or, of course, we could jump to the New Testament. And there the Apostle Paul again in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, which really has to do with anxiousness and worry. Where he says in verse 6, he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, prayer for your own burdens is an opportunity for that. And prayer for others and their burdens kind of gets your focus off of self. That's critical. That's the thing that tends to keep us up and tends to keep us worrying. Yes?
As a general rule, would you suggest doing these outside of bed, meaning getting up and out of bed like we had said before? Or would you say just lie in bed and do this?
No, I think it's not wrong to lie in bed and do this, but you'll tend to get sleepier if you get up and you do it, and then you come back when you're real sleepy.
And 20 to 30 minutes then, that rule apply? eyes
Yeah,
closed as well?
yeah.
Okay.
You should be going to sleep once you lay down within 20 to 30 minutes. That should be a rule of thumb.
But the other one was 20 to 30 minutes away from bed, correct? Or was that just until you're tired?
No, that's just until you're
Oh,
tired.
Okay.
No. You're only away from bed until you're tired. There's no set limit on that. All right. We'll summarize it like this. Address the possible spiritual causes of insomnia. What would they be? Well, lifestyle of habitual worry and anxiety, not trusting God. That can cause insomnia. You got to find that out as a good counselor. Or maybe there's guilt over disobedience that has been not dealt with in a proper way from a biblical perspective. They haven't confessed it to God or to others. Or they haven't repented before Him and sought His forgiveness or the forgiveness of others. Or there's a lack of hard work doing all you know to do and can do to solve the issues, but doing no more than that. So there's a lack of hard work in the person's life. Or not having a biblical mindset, a mind that's so saturated with Scripture that they think biblically as a lifestyle. Their tendency is naturally to think worrisome, pessimistic, God-dishonoring, negative thoughts rather than hopeful thoughts, thoughts that rest upon the promises of God, thoughts that trust in the atonement of Christ and His constant intercession as a high priest before God that are supposed to give hope and security. There's a lifestyle of discontentment with people, with circumstances, and with God. And then when God keeps your eyelids open, they can see it as an opportunity for examination, meditation, and supplication before God. This becomes the key time and the key opportunity. All right, after we come back from break, we're going to deal with chronic fatigue syndrome. Yes, question?
What about all the drugs that are out to help people sleep? What's thoughts on that from your perspective?
Most people, if they are practicing good, wise sleep hygiene, do not need the drugs. They are quick fixes. Most people don't need them. Now, I realize there are some people who have legitimate diseases that cause insomnia, and the drugs are a real asset. So I don't want to rule that out. But for your average person, it has to do with bad lifestyle. And they shouldn't have to take the drug. And like we said, we tried to stress here is the fact that if they've done everything they can and they still aren't sleeping well, then they have to see this as an opportunity to actually use this time actively to pray, to meditate upon the Word of God, and to examine their own life. See what's going on. In order to wrap up the stuff that we talked about in regards to insomnia, I want to recommend an article for you. It's just an excellent one. In fact, it just recently came out in the Volume 4, Issue 1, Winter 2007, the Journal of Modern Ministry. And in the back of it, there's an article written about sleep disorders and biblical counseling by Charles Hodge, who is a medical doctor, not the theologian. All right, the medical doctor. Sleep disorders and biblical. And what he has written there is really, really good. It goes on through several pages of the issue of sleep loss, the causes of sleep deprivation, scriptural teaching on wise use of resources, sleep and wise use of resources, treatments for sleep loss, changing schedules, obesity treatments, practical sleep hygiene, medications and insomnia. And then he talks about, in one of the charts there, medical diseases and disorders that are known to affect sleep. This list is by no means exhaustive, but menopause will do it, benign prostate hypertrophic trophy, I should say, obesity, bursitis, obstructive sleep apnea, cancer, peptic ulcer disease, chronic pain, reflex systematic dystrophia, circadian rhythm disorder, REM behavior disorder, cough, restless leg syndrome, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, gastroesophageal reflex, seizures, and and heart disease. So that gives you just a little sampling of lists, and then he has the medications that are known to affect sleep, and this is not an exhaustive list either, but he talks about the variety of different drugs and medications that affect sleep as well. That is it's a superb, very well written article. It's the Journal of Modern Ministry. You may want to it's worth it just to pull a copy from the library and run a copy of this to put in your files. In fact, the next time I teach this class, probably one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to excerpt this article and actually try to see if I can reproduce it. But it's in Journal of Modern Ministry, Volume 4, Issue 1, Winter 2007. So you may want to pay attention to that. Well, let's see if we can turn our attention to chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, often referred to. And there, again, is a wonderful section on CFS in the Christian Counselor's Medical Desk Reference written by Robert Smith. In fact, beginning on page 167, counseling those with chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you want a more exhaustive treatment of this from a medical doctor point of view, I recommend that you read this particular article. So we're going to kind of deal with similar things that he talks about in this particular article, somewhat from a different perspective than he does here, but it all ends up the same place and in a sense in the same way. He even talks about Epstein-Barr, the virus, and how that is the most frequently used theory is that chronic fatigue syndrome is caused by Epstein-Barr virus, the EBV virus. So, and there are some pamphlets and some physicians who actually endorse that. Now, what is chronic fatigue syndrome? What are we talking about here? Well, according to Dr. Smith, he says, the title fairly well describes the condition. One of being tired all the time for a long time. Yet, for some reason, this problem seems different from the complaint that plagues many busy people. How does CFS differ from the fatigue of normal life? And then he talks about even the medical literature is somewhat vague about that. But how that is a critical question. How does chronic fatigue syndrome differ from just normal fatigue? You're just flat out tired because you have been exhausting yourself for a long time. Well, let's make some observations about this. Number one, CFS is not fatal. It's not a fatal disease, never was. Number two, this is a good thing, it's not progressive. It's not progressive. And what we mean by that is it doesn't seem to progress to higher or different stages. It usually, once it's acquired, seems to stay the same. Thirdly, there's no cure. And part of the reason that there is no cure is because it's very, very difficult to diagnose. That makes it very, very difficult to diagnose. Some say up to 24% of the population actually is affected by CFS. Symptoms last about 2.5 years and then return to normal after that. 2/3 of the people that are affected by it are women, 15 to 34 years of age, 2-to-1 over men. All right? 2-to-1 over men. Has caused some people to speculate, we're not sure, that somehow CFS is related to the menstrual cycles of a woman or of her growing older and her ability to reproduce, and somehow there seems to be a link there between the two, but it's only an associational link or a distance correspondence to it. No direct cause has ever been proven. But the fact that 2/3 are women is certainly a significant statement. Some of the medical information on this, there's no proven diagnostic or therapeutic approach exists to it at all. The main focus is on alleviating symptoms through exercise, nutrition, and drugs, oftentimes Prozac, Xanax, or some kind of placebo seems to work. And the placebos, again, like we talked about in relationship to depression, here seem to work just as well as the Prozac and the Xanax in terms of treating CFS. At one time, it was thought it was caused by Epstein-Barr virus, but 90% of American adults have an antibody for this. So that wouldn't account for 24% of the population still having it if it was an EBV virus that was causing it. There are other proposed causes of this as well, like environmental toxins, and a lot of diseases that aren't diagnosed, often it goes back to environmental causes and toxins, and some have been proven to be true. That could be an issue. Other types of viruses that have yet to be diagnosed or identified. Increase in stress is another issue. Heredity could be an issue, that it would run in families then. There have been no studies, to my knowledge, that have demonstrated that. Some have suggested it, but not demonstrated it as a hard fact. Too much exercise. There are some people that believe that too much exercise is actually what brings on chronic fatigue syndrome. Or, and this is interesting, saliva. All right, that there is something in the chemical balance of the saliva that changes the condition of the body in relationship to chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, if we were to take a look at this, the criteria, both are required here, major and minor criteria. Major criteria, new onset of persistent or relapsing debilitating fatigue or fatigability in a person who has no previous history of similar symptoms, that does not resolve with bed rest, and that is severe enough to reduce or impair average daily activity below 50% of the patient's pre-morbid activity level for a period of at least 6 months. So that would be part of the major criteria that would define CFS. Exclusion of numerous other clinical conditions that could produce similar symptoms include malignancy, autoimmune disease, bacterial, fungal, or parasitic disease, localized infection, disease related to immune deficiency virus, which is the HIV infection, chronic inflammatory disease, neuromuscular disease, endocrine diseases, drug abuse, side effects of chronic medication or other toxic agent. So, it's interesting. There could be a relationship between these, but a direct relationship has never been demonstrated from a medical or biological standpoint. Minor criteria would be this. To fulfill a symptom criteria, a symptom must have begun at or after the time of onset of increased fatigability, and must have persisted or reoccurred over a period of at least 6 months. Individual symptoms may or may not have occurred simultaneously. At least 8 of the following have to be met in this case. Symptom credibility would be this. Like, for instance, there have to be 8 of these in order for it to be defined as chronic fatigue syndrome. Anytime I read this, every time I go over this, I think about the ADD and ADHD criteria. I mean, it's very, very similar, where you've got to have a certain number of each one of the categories that are listed there in order to be definitively diagnosed with AD or ADHD. Has to be mild fever, oral temperature between 99.5 and 100.5, or chills. Sore throat, another common issue that's there. And of course that's what really causes a lot of people to think that it's directly related to the Epstein-Barr type of virus or a similar type of virus. Painful lymph nodes in the anterior or or posterior cervical or axillary distribution, or unexplained generalized muscle weaknesses, or muscle discomfort or myalgia, generalized fatigue for at least 24 hours after previously tolerated exercise, generalized headaches, unlike any previous pain, migratory arthralgia without joint swelling or redness, neuropsychologic complaints, one or more of the following: photophobia, transient visual scotoma, forgetfulness, excessive irritability, confusion, difficult thinking, inability to concentrate, depression. Wow, that describes most seminarians. Right, and the NTI exam. That's right. Sleep disturbance is another thing, and description of the main symptom complex within hours or days. Now, you need about 8 of those 11 to really be definitively diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. What's the physical criteria then? It must be documented by a physician on at least 2 occasions, at least 1 month apart. Low-grade fever, as we saw earlier in that criteria. Non-exudative pharyngitis, which basically has to do, as you can see, with viruses or sometimes bacteria from a cold, flu, or sinus infection that involves the throat. Or palatable or tender anterior or posterior cervical or axillary lymph nodes. So that would be some of the physical criteria that actually a doctor would look toward in order to try to lay some kind of diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome on a person. What about the approach then at this point? Through physical examination, if organic condition is found, then a person will need help in how to respond to the illness in a biblical manner. If that's true, if they're able to identify, hey, this person has 8, 9, 10, or 11 of these characteristics, and they diagnose them as having this, then as a counselor, we will need to help them to respond to this illness much the same way that a person has been diagnosed with cancer. Then how are you going to help them and give them the hope that God would give them? Obviously, we go back to 1 Corinthians 10:13, right? There's no temptation taken you except for what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted above what you're able, but with that temptation, He will always provide a way of escape, a way to stand up under it. Or if not found, the counselor needs to take a detailed look at problems, pressures, and unpleasant circumstances in the person's life. So there's one of 2 directions we're going to go here. Either there is a description of this as having been found, and the medical doctor would look at this as a definitive disease diagnosis, or it's not found, they're not able to find anything, then we have to look at what is it that's going on in this person's life. What are the problems that they're facing, or the pressures that they're struggling under, or the unpleasant circumstances, or maybe there's been some kind of loss or significant setback that they know that they're never going to regain or achieve, which carries this whole idea of hopelessness, probably carries a good deal of depression that's going to go along with it as well. Well, we have to do a lot of data gathering. There's no substitute for this. Like Proverbs 18:13 says, if a man speaks before he listens, he is a fool. And again, we come back to this issue here. What are the pleasant and unpleasant circumstances that are going on in their life? Sometimes it's related to marriage. Sometimes it's related to singleness. Sometimes it's related to just repeated reoccurrence of other physical diseases. And even though their body has conquered that, they've received the correct type of medical treatment, they seem to come down with this unexplainable, undiagnosable issue of chronic fatigue syndrome. What's good or bad about them? We need to ask the counselee about their circumstances. We need to then evaluate their responses. What do they think about their responses? And teach them how to respond to them in a godly way. Do they see them through God's eyes, or are they resentful? Do they see these circumstances that they're facing as part of the sovereign unfolding of God's plans? And this is where verses like Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 14 comes in. When times are good, be happy. When times are bad, Solomon says there, or when times are adverse, remember God has created one as well as the other. All right? So we've got to decide, then what does God intend us to understand about this? This problem, this physical drain that I have. How much time do they spend thinking about them and dwelling upon their particular problem? That's a critical issue as well. So what about pleasant or unpleasant circumstances? Let me add to this. One of the key things, I think, with CFS is whether or not the person is getting moderate, regular exercise. All right? This is really key. To build themselves up strength-wise. We're not talking about putting them into a heavy exercise routine. We're not talking about that. Don't do that. They won't be able to do it. They won't have the energy to do it. But mild exercise that gradually increases and begins to build some of their body strength. For some people, that's going to be harder than other people. Some people are allergic to exercise. All right? And boy, it's hard to get them to just go out and walk. I want you to go out and walk around your neighborhood for 10 minutes today. That's all I want. Just 10 minutes. Walk around the neighborhood. Oh, that's hard to do. Then you increase it to 15 minutes, then 20 minutes, then 30 minutes around the neighborhood. At least that's 30 minutes more than they were doing before. Mild exercise, which kind of gets all the right things pumping in the body. Look for factors that may contribute to the fatigue. Fatigue can be aggravated by responses to life. They're not responding to life in a real good way. And so as a result of that, their tendency is to just bow out. I mean, we see this. Take your Bible just for a moment and go over to Proverbs chapter 26. You get the idea that the lazy man or the sluggard of Proverbs oftentimes has the same kind of characteristics. Boy, you're going to get people mad if you directly launch into this, but has the same kind of characteristics of the chronic fatigue syndrome person. That doesn't mean that everybody with CFS is a sluggard. I don't want to say that, because some people really want to work on their problems. So you've got to be very, very careful when you come to this. But when you get to Proverbs 26, verse 12, he says, "Do you see a man that's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him." The sluggard says, "There's a lion in the road, a lion in the open square. As the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He's weary of bringing it back to his mouth again. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can give a discreet answer." What's implied there is that 7 men have just walked into his house to persuade him, "Hey, we were just outside. There's no lion in the road. Everything's okay. Get up." Well, he's so lazy. On the one hand, he's got an arrogance and pride to him. He won't listen to the counsel of 7 men who answer discreetly. There's no lion in the road, they say. He won't listen to that. On the other hand, he's so lazy, he doesn't even have, and I know that this is kind of an ancient analogy, have enough energy to lift the food to his mouth and to feed himself. Sometimes a person that's suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome is like that. Now, please, again, don't go away saying that what we're talking about here is that a person with chronic fatigue syndrome is always a sluggard. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there are characteristics of a sluggard that are similar. And there are some who think they have chronic fatigue syndrome when in reality they don't. They're lazy. They are sluggards. And as a result, there has been just a general running down of their body And when their body gets run down, then they don't feel good. And they're susceptible to more colds and more viruses and more disease than the average person. And so it has a physical effect on them. Furthermore, there's frequent thoughts of unpleasantness of fatigue. And they start to, the thoughts of that drive them into depression. They become very, very depressed. For example, the unfairness of what is happening. Why does it have to happen to me? Now, that's something that we can address from a biblical perspective. Because really, from a biblical perspective, God is a just God. And we need to zero in on the fact that he's a just God. God has never made any mistakes, and he didn't begin with this person with CFS. He didn't begin with you. You're not God's first mistake. He somehow is not unjust here. Or you find them wishing for something better. Oh, I wish I had a better body. I wish I had better circumstances. I wish I had better whatever. Fear and worry is also a very common theme that seems to take place here. Fear of personal health and how their personal health is going to go. A worry of not getting work done because of the fatigue. They start a project and get going and they don't have enough energy to finish it. Or worry of getting over the fatigue. You know, is this ever going to come to an end? Am I ever going to come to the point where I don't have to suffer from this anymore? Or there's fear of possible accusations because of the fatigue. They fear that somebody's going to come along and accuse them of possibly being lazy or being a sluggard. This is something that they worry about. They are fearful of. Or there's lack of proper sleep. What are the thoughts when lying in bed? A person with chronic fatigue often rests a lot during the day, and as a result of that, what we talked about in terms of the stages of sleep at night, they're not getting all the stages of sleep. So that, again, has a cumulative effect upon their body. That wears on the immune system and represses the immune system. So all of those things. Attitude is another issue. They may have been accused of faking the symptoms, right? And most people that come to you that are professing Christians are not going to do that. They're not going to fake it. They're really describing what they feel, right? They're more concerned with the praises of men than the praises of God. And that's the reason why their attitude is so negative, right? Because they're obviously not going to receive much praises from men. From a man's standpoint, they look lazy, they look non-responsive to life, they look unhappy, they oftentimes look depressed, they shuffle around, there's no spring in their step. Or maybe guilt is a critical issue here. And of course, there is no such thing as false guilt. We've talked about that in previous counseling classes, but no such thing as false guilt. False guilt doesn't exist. Guilt is a fact that has to do with culpability before God. If they are aware of unconfessed and unrepented of guilt that's a part of their past, this will have a drain on their conscience and their attitude as well. Unconfessed sin does that. David talks about that. When he didn't confess his sin, his bones, as it were, wasted away within him. Or G here. Is the person taking advantage of the fatigue for some reason? Are they taking advantage of this by overreacting to everything? Or they're attempting to manipulate other people. Well, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't fulfill this responsibility, I can't fulfill that responsibility. You're going to have to do this for me, you're going to have to do that for me. And they use their chronic fatigue syndrome as a way to manipulate other people. These are things that you've got to be aware of in counseling, and becomes really a source of frustration and strife within families. So are they using it for this particular purpose? What are some of the possible causes here? Well, The fatigue may be the result of one's responses to the problems of life, not a result of a virus. Until later on, medical science is able to demonstrate that definitively. Quote-unquote psychosomatic, people, because of their unbiblical responses to the problems in life, create symptoms. In fact, psychosomatic is kind of an old term now. It's psychoneuroimmunology now instead of psychosomatic. Psychoneuroimmunology is the new term for this, but it means the same thing. That when people think that they're sick, then they start to manifest symptoms of that sickness. All right? And then it creates the symptoms. Then secondly, not organic, but a habit. In other words, this is a way that probably has a preconditioning element to it, goes way back in their life, maybe from the time that they were a child. They learn to respond to life in this way. And it's a withdrawal issue. They learn that they received a lot of sympathy and a lot of support, a lot of kudos from people when they act helpless or they acted weak or they acted fatigued. They realize that that was the case, and so as a result, they fall into a life pattern that's that way. Or it's organic. I mean, obviously, as biblical counselors, we're not going to rule out the fact that there may be a component of this that is really organic that hasn't been discovered yet. Is this organic? And maybe it's just not known yet. Well, that's possible, but that doesn't change it a whole lot in relationship to our counsel to people. Because if it is an organic problem, then as I said before, you're going to treat it like you do every other disease. And by the way, there's excellent, the first chapter or so of Dr. Bob Smith's book here, The Christian Counselor's Medical Desk Reference. He talks about a Christian's response to illness and disease. And that's just very excellent biblical development of how to respond to that kind of thing. In this particular case, if it is organic, then you can teach them, hey, listen, we live in a sin-cursed world. Disease is a result of that sin-cursed world. And we're all infected with some kind of disease, one way or the other. And the key is not so much whether or not I have a disease. The key is my response to it from God's perspective. How am I handling that? Which brings us to the issue of unbiblical responses. So oftentimes you are able to identify people with CFS. They have unbiblical responses. This energy has been used in a non-constructive manners without benefit of relaxation from the fatigue. Some of the examples of this: worry, which is a concern over the future. The wrong day, can't act upon the future. Rather than releasing bodily energy through productive activity, it actually activates more energy that is not used. So worry hypes the body up and uses up productive energy in unproductive ways. And so that person is in this pattern that repeats itself of getting worry, then fatigue. No energy. Worry, fatigue. Worry, fatigue. Worry, fatigue. And it drains energy in an unnecessary way. Or there's focusing on unsolved problems, and the discomfort from them also wastes the energy and hinders the restful sleep. Anytime a person focuses on unsolved problems, then they're not thinking in a God-honoring way. They're not focusing on God's promises. They're not focusing on God's ability and to be able to overcome their problems. And so as a result of that, all of that focused concentration and the discomfort from those particular problems ends up draining energy in an unnecessary way, and thereby hinders restful sleep at night. So we toss and turn, like we saw there in Proverbs chapter 23 of the man who tosses and turns on his bed. Or there's overwhelming desire to be rid of fatigue can also be a contributing factor. In other words, the main focus of their life is to get rid of the fatigue. So they run all over the place. They seek nutritional ways to get rid of the fatigue. They seek medical cures, obscure ones, maybe in foreign countries to get rid of the fatigue. They're running all over the place in order to find, as if the whole goal of their life is to get rid of the fatigue. No, that's not the whole goal of their life. The goal of their life is to honor Christ and to serve Him. If they can find an answer to the fatigue, that's fine. If they can't, then they have to trust the sovereignty of God in their life. They don't allow their life to be consumed. This becomes a dominant theme of their life, running around trying to find the cure. It increases the discomfort, ultimately, of the feeling. And in reality, it's something like this that it becomes the idol. I gotta find a cure at all costs. Even if I have to spend my last penny, I've got to feel better. And as a result, they waste time with their friends, they waste time with their family, they waste time with their church, time that they could have used very productively to honor and glorify the Lord. It's all zeroed in on trying to get rid of the fatigue. So this can be a very destructive path that they choose to go after in their life. What's the counsel that we need to give a person like this who experiences chronic fatigue? I love that picture. All right, there's a good picture of a person with chronic fatigue syndrome. What's the counsel? Well, see a medical doctor. It's one of the first things. Not just any doctor, but a good medical doctor. CFS symptoms are mimicked by other diseases, so we've got to make sure that it's not some other kind of disease that's going on. That's really critical. So the first thing you've got to do is see a doctor. Spend a lot of time gathering data about their life, their attitudes, their thoughts, their actions and reactions to unpleasant situations, stresses, worries. This is really key. Helping them keep a journal of their thought. A thought journal can be very productive and will also help you to identify whether or not this person is still struggling with depression. Don't minimize the problem by calling the fatigue imaginary. I don't even get into that with counselees. I don't even debate whether or not it's imaginary or real. I just assume that they're coming with the problem, that it is a problem for them. Whether it is imaginary or real, God will identify in the long run if we deal with this biblically. Okay? So I don't even debate that issue. That's a non-issue. If somebody wants to debate it with you and they claim they have CFS, I say, listen, I don't know. I'm not God. God's the only one who has the answer to this. But I do have a very clear direction from His Word on how we need to go about handling this or looking at it. It is a real symptom. All right? It is a real symptom. We're not calling it necessarily a real disease, but it is a real symptom in this particular case. What are the reasons for the illness? Well, as we alluded to just a minute ago, the curse of sin is part of the reason. Sin engendered as well. There are some things that we do that bring on, we handle our life, we don't treat our bodies well, and that brings on certain diseases as well. That's sin engendered diseases like James 5:15 and 16 talks about. Or maybe, as the Apostle Paul acknowledged, maybe it's the type of thing that is to prevent sin in that person's life. Paul had a weakness, a thorn in the flesh, whether that was a person or a disease. We can go back and forth and debate on that. There's different theories that run around there. What is that thorn in the flesh? Paul had a thorn in the flesh, and he said that God had given it to him because of the surpassing greatness of his revelations to keep him from becoming too proud. So is there a possibility that this chronic fatigue syndrome is actually a tool of God to enable this person to be more holy? Is that a possibility? And this is something that they're going to actually struggle with for the rest of their life. But it is to be looked at as a very positive thing, not negative, that it's God's tool of sanctification in their life. And can they view it almost the way the man who was born blind in John 9, can they view it as something ultimately that brings glory to God? So as a result of this, it results in a healing. Or his healing resulted in bringing glory to God. Can this, whether that person is healed or not, bring glory to God? Even if they're not healed, is that a possibility? Well, if there is no organic cause, then look for unbiblical responses to life. And especially what you're dealing with here is patterns. You're looking for patterns, attitudinal, and actions and reactions to unbiblical things of life. Where are those patterns? How have they formed in their thinking and behavior? Help your counselor see that it is idolatry when getting rid of the fatigue is more important than pleasing God and being responsible in spite of the fatigue. And that's when then getting rid of it becomes the reigning, ruling motive of the heart that drives and controls them. Remember, the symptoms, again, are real. Even if there is no way to identify that it is an organic cause, remember, the symptoms are real. You may need to help in scheduling, discipline, taking thoughts captive. You can't expect as much from a chronic fatigue person in terms of actual mental or physical exertion, but you got to expect something. And so you may have to schedule, even though compared to the normal person, it's not a very rigid schedule. You may have to talk about discipline issues, but compared to the normal person, it's not as rigid. Or taking thoughts captive, their ability to concentrate is not as great, but you're still aiming at a goal. You're helping them rein in their life and control what they can control to God's honor and glory. Focus on how one can glorify God and increase effectiveness of ministry. How can that happen? All right, so you have chronic fatigue syndrome. How can you glorify God and increase your effectiveness as a result of this? That's the real critical issue. If it is organic, then pleasing God is possible even if the fatigue does not leave. Even if it becomes a persistent thing that goes on indefinitely, then we can learn to please God. It's the person who produces fruit in the midst of those stresses that's key. Change the focus to pleasing God rather than getting rid of the fatigue again. That's a major theme here. The problem now is their response to it. It's not getting rid of this fatigue. It's how they're going to respond to it, how they're going to allow it to shape and deform their thoughts, their activities, their decisions in life. How is it going to do that? How can this be used to glorify God again? We come back to that question. All right, if it is an organic thing and they're suffering from it, then how can God take this disease and bring glory to himself in my life? We can see this in John 9:3 with the man born blind again. In 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10 with the Apostle Paul again, where his strength is made perfect in my weakness. So the grace of God is exalted there. Or James 1, 2 through 4. We're supposed to consider it joy when we face all kinds of trials and different temptations. How can we be joyful in the midst of that? And then ultimately, here's the key thing. And this is the key on whether or not this person is really interested in working on this God's way. Are they able to thank God for it? When they get to the point, when your counseling gets to the point where they say, you know, I am thankful to God for what has happened to me. When that happens, then you know that their thinking has changed. You know it's headed down the right direction. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 20 says, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God, even the Father. So, in all things, that includes even chronic fatigue syndrome and facing chronic fatigue syndrome. F, then, see the problem as something used by God to develop the character of Christ in the individual's life. See the problem as being used by God to develop the character. Romans 8:28 and 29. All things work together for good to them that are called. Matthew 20:28. Look for the ways to be serving. All right. Matthew 20:28. The Lord, that's what the Lord came not to serve, or not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So, the Son of Man did not come to be served, verse 28 says, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So how can they do that? Was Jesus ever exhausted? Yes. Was he ever tired? Yes. Did he ever spend sleepless nights? Yes. You can see him all night long praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. So they're not the only ones to have gone through this, and we have a sympathetic high priest because of it. Then control and use thoughts and minds productively. 2 Corinthians 10:5, bringing all of our thoughts captive. Use our mind for praying, reading, and other profitable things. Lying awake at night. Meditate on Scripture rather than thinking about unpleasantness. Replace habit of focusing on symptoms to focusing on whatever things are true, honest, just, worthy of good report. Anything that's praiseworthy, think on these things. The primary goal, again, should be pleasing God. 2 Corinthians 5:9, Paul says, I make it my goal to please him. Don't try to manipulate God or use God as a magic genie in order to get rid of your problems. Don't use that. But in all of this, it's vitally important then that we learn to focus on life. On life. Now, here's some closing passages I want to point your attention to as we bring this to a close. But Psalm 118 and verse 24. Psalm 118:24, where it says, this is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. In 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 8. 2 Corinthians 9:8. Where he says, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, that everything, having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. Then there's 2 Corinthians 12:8 through 10. Verse 8 says, concerning this I entreat the Lord 3 times that it may depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weakness, that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Strong, that is, in the Lord. He's not talking about physical strength, but strong in the Lord. And, of course, Philippians 4:13, where it talks about I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, which basically is really focused on discontentment. So this can grow out of a spirit of discontentment in life. He's learned to be content in all things. Realize that the only real victory is going to come through dealing with the problem from a biblical and eternal perspective. That's key. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 14 through 18. Again, verse 16 says, therefore we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So Peter had joy in the midst of difficulty. You can see that in 1 Peter, all of 1 Peter as well as 2 Peter. And in the midst of most severe persecution and difficulty, there was still an overriding joy. So that helps us to understand not just insomnia, but chronic fatigue syndrome, and how we have to be sensitive and address those particular issues with people that will be seeking us out for pastoral counsel.